Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in Exodus chapter 21, verse 22, through chapter 23, verse 13. If men fight and hit a pregnant woman, and her child is born prematurely, but there is no serious injury, he will surely be punished in accordance with what the woman's husband demands of him, and he will pay what the court decides. But if there is serious injury, then you will give a life for a life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. If a man strikes the eye of his male servant or his female servant so that he destroys it, he will let the servant go free as compensation for the eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his male servant or his female servant, he will let the servant go free as compensation for the tooth. If an ox gores a man or a woman so that either dies, then the ox must surely be stoned, and its flesh must not be eaten, but the owner of the ox will be acquitted. But if the ox had the habit of goring, and its owner was warned, and he did not take the necessary precautions, and then it killed a man or a woman, the ox must be stoned, and the man must be put to death. If a ransom is set for him, then he must pay the redemption for his life according to whatever amount was set for him. If the ox gores a son or daughter, the owner will be dealt with according to this rule. If the ox gores a male servant or a female servant, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver, and the ox must be stoned. If a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit must repay the loss. He must give money to its owner, and the dead animal will become his. If the ox of one man injures the ox of his neighbor so that it dies, then they will sell the live ox and divide its proceeds, and they will also divide the dead ox. Or if it is known that the ox had the habit of goring, and its owner did not take the necessary precautions, he must surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal will become his. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox, and 4 sheep for the 1 sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no blood guilt for him. If the sun has risen on him, then there is blood guilt for him. A thief must surely make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he will be sold for his theft. If the stolen item should in fact be found alive in his possession, whether it be an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he must pay back double. If a man grazes his livestock in a field or a vineyard, and he lets the livestock loose and they graze in the field of another man, he must make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. If a fire breaks out and spreads to thorn bushes, so that stacked grain or standing grain or the whole field is consumed, the one who started the fire must surely make restitution. If a man gives his neighbor money or articles for safekeeping, and it is stolen from the man's house, if the thief is caught, he must repay double. If the thief is not caught, then the owner of the house will be brought before the judges to see whether he has laid his hand on his neighbor's goods. In all cases of illegal possessions, whether for an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any kind of lost item about which someone says, "This belongs to me," the matter of the two of them will come before the judges, and the one whom the judge declares guilty must repay double to his neighbor. If a man gives his neighbor a donkey, or an ox, or a sheep, or any beast to keep, and it dies, or is hurt, or is carried away without anyone seeing it, then there will be an oath to the Lord between the two of them, that he has not laid his hand on his neighbor's goods, and its owner will accept this, and he will not have to pay. But if it was stolen from him, he will pay its owner. If it is torn in pieces, then he will bring it for evidence, and he will not have to pay for what was torn. If a man borrows an animal from his neighbor, and it is hurt or dies when its owner was not with it, the man who borrowed it will surely pay. If its owner was with it, he will not have to pay. If it was hired, what was paid for the hire covers it. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and has sexual relations with her, he must surely endow her to be his wife. If her father refuses to give her to him, he must pay money for the bride price of virgins. You must not allow a sorceress to live. Whoever has sexual relations with a beast must surely be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to a god other than the Lord alone must be utterly destroyed. You must not wrong a foreigner, nor oppress him, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. You must not afflict any widow or orphan. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my anger will burn, and I will kill you with a sword, and your wives will be widows, and your children will be fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people who are needy among you, do not be like a moneylender to him. Do not charge him interest. If you do take the garment of your neighbor in pledge, you must return it to him by the time the sun goes down, for it is his only covering. It is his garment for his body. What else can he sleep in? And when he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. You must not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. You must also do this for your oxen and for your sheep. 7 days they may remain with their mothers, but give them to me on the 8th day. You will be holy people to me. You must not eat any meat torn by animals in the field. You must throw it to the dogs. You must not give a false report. Do not make common cause with the wicked to be a malicious witness. You must not follow a crowd in doing evil things. In a lawsuit, you must not offer testimony that agrees with a crowd so as to pervert justice. And you must not show partiality to a poor man in his lawsuit. If you encounter your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, you must by all means return it to him. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen under its load, you must not ignore him, but be sure to help him with it. You must not turn away justice for your poor people in their lawsuits. Keep your distance from a false charge. Do not kill the innocent and the righteous, for I will not justify the wicked. You must not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and subverts the words of the righteous. You must not oppress a foreigner, since you know the life of a foreigner, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. For 6 years you are to sow your land and gather in its produce, but in the 7th year you must let it lie fallow, and leave it alone, so that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave any animal in the field may eat. You must do likewise with your vineyard and your olive grove. For 6 days you are to do your work, but on the 7th day you must cease, in order that your ox and your donkey may rest, and that your female servant's son and any hired help may refresh themselves. Pay attention to do everything I have told you, and do not even mention the names of other gods. Do not let them be heard on your lips. Yeah. So, have a bunch of laws that Israel was supposed to follow. Starting with the pregnant woman in Exodus 21:22. If men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished according to the woman's husband. Accordingly, as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. This is an example of a case of retribution where a pregnant woman was injured in a conflict and she gave birth prematurely. The penalty was only to be assessed if there was lasting damage. If no lasting damage resulted, there are no damages awarded. Perhaps this was recognition that the law cannot address every loss or consequence, and that only permanent consequences are justly compensated. But if any harm follows, for the accidental assault, the offender must still pay some compensation, even though both mother and child survived. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye. If lasting damage resulted, the eye for eye principle always limited retribution. This law was meant to block man's natural desire for vengeance. It was not given as a license for revenge. Our tendency is to want to do more against the offending party than what they did to us. This principle can apply to our modern practice of assessing huge punitive damages in lawsuits, and this law presents the principle that only the loss itself is to be compensated. You shall give life for life. This principle leads some to wonder if in ancient Israel people were routinely killed for what we might consider accidental death or manslaughter. It is important to correlate this principle of you shall give life for life with Numbers 35:31, which allows a substitute ransom payment for loss of life that was not willful and premeditated murder. In Numbers 35:31, it says, Moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. This prohibition indicates that it was common practice to take ransom money for wrongful death in other circumstances. Yeah, which is an important thing to keep in mind here, that if that was I think it was only that case and maybe also the life of a sorcerer where it was prohibited. But keep in mind that it is not prohibited everywhere else. So, thus we conclude that the defendant must surrender to the deceased child's father or wife's husband the monetary value of each life if either or both were harmed. The principle of eye for eye had a different application for servants. If injured by the master, the servant receives something more precious than an eye, his freedom. These laws don't try to make the master feel a certain way about his slave. Instead, the laws guide the behavior of the master, giving him incentive to protect and honor his slave, treating them more like an employee than a work animal. Yeah, if he beat them like an animal, they would go free, essentially. If this did not teach them humanity, it taught them caution, as one rash blow might have deprived them of all right to the future services of the slave, and the self-interest obliged them to be cautious and circumspect. From Clark. Yeah, and then you had bits about this ox here, that if it gored someone, then that was treated differently than if it gored someone and it was in the habit of goring before. So there were also, neglect was handled a separate way. Yeah, intent and neglect, which I think that's kind of a running theme through more of it as well, through more of these laws as well. If an ox owner had an ox whom he knew to be aggressive and he failed to control the animal, he was guilty of murder and punished as such. If there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life. This was an acceptable settlement. If a servant was killed under such circumstances, the price of restitution was 30 shekels of silver, which was considered the price of a slave. Even in Israel, a slave was still a man. His blood brings blood guilt, like that of any other man. Significantly, this was the same price Jesus was sold for when Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Yeah. Which is also commented on, 30 pieces of silver, that grand price with which I was valued. If one man's ox hurts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it. These laws required the investigation and analysis of judges, so that the application of the law took into account findings of intent and negligence. There's a sense in which these are simply applications of the general principles of justice and fairness. To a struggling Israelite farmer, fair payment for the death of an ox might mean the difference between life and death, or at least between freedom and slavery for debt. Yeah, I mean, an ox is a substantial investment. If a man steals an ox or a sheep, the command against theft was already stated in the Ten Commandments. Here are more specific principles given to judges, so they could apply the principle in the daily life and administration of justice among the people of Israel. Yeah, and with these proceedings, it, I guess, is implicitly in there that these cases would come before a judge, and it would be handled in a fair manner with an investigation being performed and with both sides presenting their case, not mob rule. So, just contrasting the two. He shall restore. The Mosaic law did not send a person to jail because of theft. Instead, the thief was required to restore what he stole, plus an additional penalty. In this passage, the penalty could be anywhere from 500%, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox, to 200%, he shall restore double. The reason for fivefold penalty in the case of stealing an ox is probably because one man stole the means of another man's livelihood. The principle would extend to taking any of the man's plowing or cultivating implements. This can be regarded as a positive approach to the punishment of criminals, putting them to productive restitution and compensating the victims of their theft. These principles are often ignored in the modern administration of justice. They are also, as a principle, ignored in many Christian lives. This chapter is full of restitution, of which there is far too little in ordinary Christian life. We try to make amends for injury done to another by an extraordinary amount of civility, but we are reluctant, in so many words, to frankly confess that we have done wrong and make proper reparation for the act or speech. Yeah. If the thief is found breaking in, and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. If the sun has risen on him, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. A property owner had the right to protect his property with force, but only with reasonable force. The assumption was that if it was daylight, the property owner had the ability to defend himself short of lethal force. It is typical of Israel's merciful law that even a thief has his rights. Yeah, you have to take into account that this is another being, a human being that that you're dealing with, and if you have the ability to not use lethal force to deal with the threat, then you have to use non-lethal force to deal with the threat. He shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. In the case of where he let his animal graze in another man's field. This was a fair punishment and significant enough to give a farmer a reason not to allow his animals to carelessly and destructively graze. These laws also began by laying emphasis on the guilt of carelessness. The truth emphasized is that no man must live in his life on the basis of selfishness or wholly alone, and that wrong inflicted on neighbor by neighbor in the material realm becomes a sin against God in the moral realm. He who kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. Restitution was also required in cases of vandalism or foolish negligence, even if one kept the property of another. The Mosaic legal system had a high view of personal responsibility, even with the property of others. Yeah, like if you see your neighbor's donkey struggling under a load, you have to help it. You don't go by. If someone gives you something to hold for them, you are then responsible for it as a faithful steward or manager. This principle also includes what God gives us to manage or steward for him. Reminded of the parable of the talents there, with the man given 5, the man given 3, and the man given 1 talent. And the master going away and coming back, and the one servant earning 5 more talents, the other earning 3 more talents, and the one who had the 1 not earning anything, and accusing his master of gathering where he didn't sow, and so on. And and his talent being given to the one with the 10. But I think, to me, the application is that we as Christians have been given everything by Christ. We owe our very existence and being to him, and also our salvation from death. And as such, we have been given many things from God, including, in a very real sense, our talents. And we should be using those for the glory of the Lord, and not selfishly going about our own business. That is selfish ambition or vain conceit. Yeah, it's our responsibility as ones who have been given something by the Lord to be faithful stewards of those things. Long and short of it, mostly the long of it. Any kind of lost thing which another claims to be his. In the law of Israel, an owner did not lose ownership simply because the object was lost. If another found the object and the owner laid claim to it, it was to be decided by the judges. Then an oath of the Lord shall be between them both, that he has not put his hand into his neighbor's goods, and the owner of it shall accept that. In such cases, the owner of the animal was obligated to accept the sworn testimony of the accused, unless there was evidence that gave reasonable doubt to the truthfulness of the accused. This principle is the foundation of our idea that a man is innocent until proven guilty. In this case, the man's oath was taken as true, unless proof to the contrary could be found. He shall bring the torn carcass as evidence. Production of the carcass would show that while the shepherd could not prevent the kill, he was alert enough to stop the devouring of the prey. If a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her. Some claim this passage did not prohibit premarital sex, but it did prohibit, or at least strongly discourage it in practice, because it required a man to either marry or provide for a woman he had premarital sex with. The Hebrew Betula was an unmarried girl who was always presumed to be a virgin. He shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. This law emphasized the principle that there is no such thing as casual sex. Both Old and New Testaments state that sexual relations carry lasting consequences. This was an exceedingly wise and humane law, and must have operated powerfully against seduction and fornication, because the person who might feel inclined to take the advantage of a young woman knew that he must marry her and give her dowry. This law encouraged both men and women to value the virginity of a woman, since a man has taken a girl without paying the bride price he must pay, for who else will pay it now? It's not that the virginity of men was worthless or ignored, yet the law encouraged greater care and preservation for the virginity of women until marriage and the advantageous circumstances for child raising. A man illustrated the value of virginity with a true story about a friend who owned an antique store and had a table for sale. The table was worth $600, but was marked down to $300. A man tried to bargain her down to $200, and not only did she refuse, but she realized the true value of the table and upped the price to its true worth, even when offered $300. The man finally bought the table for $600, and certainly treated it like a $600 table, because its worth had been recognized and fought for. Some women who know men treat them shabbily contribute to the problem by selling themselves cheaply. Yeah, and we shouldn't sell ourselves cheaply. Because, if nothing else, we are bought with a price. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. If the man who took advantage of the woman was considered a completely unacceptable husband by the father of the wronged woman, then that man had to pay the dowry without receiving the bride. This was a strong incentive against taking advantage of young women, because not only is he going to pay the bride price, but he's not going to receive a wife. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Among the ancients, the practice of sorcery had two associations. First, contact with dark or demonic powers or persons. Second, altered states through drugs and potions. These were understood to be a connection between drug taking and occultist practices. This law shows that such communication is possible, and the penalty shows that it is dangerous. The King James Version translates sorceress as witch. An enchantress, sorceress, whose help was sometimes sought in enticing young maidens to folly. The man witch is also here meant, but the woman witch mentioned, both because women are more inclined to that sin, and also because the weaker sex is not to be spared for this fault. From trap. Taking this noun sorceress, the verb is to use incantations, magic, sorcery, or the arts of witchcraft. Our English witch is alleged to have come from to wit, that is, to know. In the adjectival wittig or wittich, contracted to witch. The Greeks rendered our word by pharmakos, poisoners, since sorcerers dealt in drugs and pharmaceutical potions. Yeah, I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, where he was saying specifically about the slaying of witches, that we only don't, trying to recall exactly how he phrased it, that the slaying of witches isn't done anymore because we don't believe that witches exist anymore. That is, that one wouldn't, oh man, I've lost all of the eloquence of Lewis. Curses. One wouldn't think that a man is a humanitarian for not putting out a mousetrap because he didn't have any mice. Yeah, but if these people are in contact with evil spirits and enchanting other people and bringing the very power of hell on them, then surely these vile quislings should be put to death. So. Many of the Israelites had no doubt learned these curious arts from their long residence with the Egyptians, and so much were the Israelites attached to them that we find such arts in repute among them, and various practices of this kind prevailed through the whole country, the whole of the Jewish history, notwithstanding the offense was capital, and in all cases punished with death. Yeah, I mean, you had Saul fairly long after this, perhaps several hundred years. inquiring of this witch at Endor about the spirit of Samuel. Yeah. Which we shouldn't. We should be aware that we are in spiritual warfare. That is, that there is a supernatural element to reality that we can't see, and messing with evil spiritual powers is not only wrong, but has consequences in the physical realm. And it's treated as real enough in the New Testament, where Jesus casts out many demons who were inhabiting people and afflicting them with various maladies, like becoming mute or throwing them down so that they have seizures and tossing them into the fire. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. Bestiality was practiced in the ancient world, and here God commanded specifically against it. This offensive act apparently was prevalent among the Canaanites. Bestiality was not only an obvious perversion, it figured so often in the Canaanite cycle, tales of Baal, that it probably had a religious significance for the Canaanites. It is surprising to some that bestiality is legal in some European nations and a subculture practices and promotes it, yet there should be no surprise. If God's standard is rejected in one area of sexual morality, then the standards are often left up to the individual to decide. It is Christian civilization and morality that has discouraged and condemned fornication, adultery, pedophilia, polygamy, prostitution, homosexuality, gender confusion, and the like. As Christian civilization and morality are increasingly mocked and rejected, it is no surprise that all of these sexual practices are increasingly practiced, supported, and encouraged. Some years ago, a student group at a university responded to the school's sponsorship of GLAD, that is Gay Lesbian Awareness Days, with a mocking parody they called BAD, Bestiality Awareness Days. University administration did not allow them to promote or carry out their parody celebration, but there was no rational reason to prohibit this apart from a biblical foundation for morality. Yeah. And when we reject God, there isn't a rational reason why one should prohibit these things. Well, yeah, ultimately, if there's no moral lawgiver, then there exists no morality outside of oneself except what what one considers to be right in one's own eyes. If the moral measure for a sexual act is, if it feels good, do it, then there's no moral measure, and the culture will become increasingly depraved until this changes. You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. Don't take your money at interest. To the poor here, anyway. The reason for the prohibition is presumably that the poor man borrows in his need. The loan is seen as assistance to a neighbor, and to make money from his need would be immoral. You shall not revile God nor curse the ruler of your people. The most basic measure of holiness is what we say. God cares how we talk about him and those in rightful authority over us. According to Clark and others, the context shows that God, Elohim, here is a reference to judges. There were laws against the blaspheming of God, but here, combined with nor curse the ruler of your people, suggests that Elohim here refers to Israel's legal judges, as it sometimes does, and was quoted by Paul at his trial before the high priest. And the giving of the firstborn to God. Don't circulate a false report. The only way to obey this command is to put a stop to a false report. Doing nothing or remaining neutral is to allow the false report to circulate. You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. No partiality was to be shown to a poor man. The poor were not to be favored just because they were poor, any more than the rich should be favored because they are rich. The facts of a case and the principles of justice should decide a dispute, not the high or low standing or perceived victim status of those involved. Yeah, but justice is to be done. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil. It is easy and dangerous to turn aside after many to pervert justice, to follow with our peers in popular opinion. When doing so promotes a false report or perverts justice, then it is sin. This is why it is so important for us to choose our crowd carefully. Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. The history of all right movements has been, in the first place, the history of lonely souls who, having heard the authentic voice of God, have stood alone or in small minorities. Yeah. Been reading Athanasius's On the Incarnation, and I'm not sure exactly the circumstances of it, but apparently Athanasius contra mundum, that is, Athanasius against the world, was a common enough saying because Athanasius had a view of Christ in the Incarnation that was wholly separate from what the majority were talking about at the time. And he didn't bow the knee to accept a wrong view of the Incarnation, despite peer pressure. And in the same way, we're commanded here, or at least the Israelites are commanded here, and we should take note of it, not to pervert justice by following the many. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. This command to do good for your enemy was important. It showed that goodness and kindness in Israel was not only required for those one liked and loved, but to all. One might not need a command to do this for a friend, but it was necessary for the enemy and the one who hates you. The principle was clear. How you feel about someone does not determine right and wrong behavior toward them. There are principles of justice that must be observed above our feelings. Don't take a bribe. Don't impress a stranger. 6 years you shall sow, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. The principle of the Sabbath applied to more than the work week. There were also Sabbath years where the land was to rest and lie fallow, 1 year out of the 7. By tradition, some in Israel accomplished this by only cultivating 6/7 of their land at any one time and practicing a method of crop rotation. Interesting. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day.